Picture a Saturday morning in 1968. The smell of fresh wax and warm asphalt drifts across a dealership lot on the edge of town. Rows of chrome catch the sun. A father walks his family past the showroom glass, past the salesman in the short-sleeved shirt, and stops in front of a brand-new sedan with a badge on the hood that meant something. That badge promised solidity. It promised that you had arrived. And today, almost every car your grandfather pointed to with pride is a name you will never see on a dealer lot again. The badges are gone. The dealerships are parking lots and dollar stores. Now this is the story of 10 American car brands that filled the highways for generations and then quietly disappeared. For most of the last century, the American road was crowded with names. Not just Ford and Chevrolet, but dozens of proud independent makers and a whole constellation of brands under the big companies. Each one aimed at a slightly different family, a slightly different dream. Then the ground shifted. The independents could not match the scale of Detroit's giants. The giants in turn built too many brands that competed with one another for the same buyer. Oil shocks rattled the gas guzzlers. Foreign cars arrived, cheaper and more reliable than anyone in Detroit wanted to admit. And finally, in the hard years at the end of the 2000s, the math simply ran out. One by one, the names that had defined the American driveway were retired, and the families who had been loyal to them for 40 years found themselves orphaned. Let's remember them. We begin with Oldsmobile, and it hurts, because Oldsmobile was almost as old as the automobile itself. Ransom Olds built his first cars back in 1897, which makes Oldsmobile one of the very first car brands in America. For more than 100 years, it was the dependable heart of General Motors. It gave us the rocket V8 engine that helped kick off the horsepower age, and the Cutlass, which in the 1970s was one of the best-selling cars in the entire country. Oldsmobile was the car your dentist drove, the car of comfortable middle America, but by the late 1990s that was exactly the problem. Younger buyers saw it as their parents' car, and General Motors could not convince them otherwise. The company announced it would wind the brand down, and in 2004, after more than a century, the last Oldsmobile rolled off the line. 107 years ended with a quiet final model and a commemorative plaque. Next is Pontiac, the brand that was supposed to be the opposite of stuffy. While Oldsmobile sold comfort, Pontiac sold excitement, and for a long time it delivered. This was the home of the GTO, the car many people call the first true muscle car, and the Firebird and the Trans Am, that screaming eagle on the hood that defined a certain kind of American cool. We build excitement. The commercials promised. But by the 2000s, badge after badge of Pontiac had become little more than a Chevrolet wearing different plastic, and the excitement had faded into ordinary family sedans. When General Motors went through its painful bankruptcy and restructuring in 2009, the company had to choose which brands to keep. Pontiac was not among them. By 2010, the dealerships were closing and the Screaming Eagle was gone. Then there's Plymouth. Walter Chrysler created Plymouth to be the everyman's brand, the affordable car that would let his company go toe-to-toe with Ford and Chevrolet for the ordinary working family. And for decades it did. Plymouth gave us the Roadrunner with its cartoon bird and its beep-beep horn, and the Barracuda, and the big finned Furies that prowled American streets in the 50s and 60s. It was the brand of first cars and second cars, the sensible choice in millions of driveways. But over the years, Chrysler let Plymouth blur into its other brands, until a Plymouth and a Dodge were often the same car under the skin. By the late 1990s, there was little reason for it to exist on its own, and in 2001 the brand was retired. The everyman's car had simply run out of road. Our fourth name is Mercury, Ford's brand for the family that wanted a little more. Edsel Ford created it back in the late 1930s to sit right between an ordinary Ford and a luxury Lincoln for the buyer who had done well enough to step up but not so well as to go all the way. For generations it worked beautifully. The Mercury Cougar was a genuine icon, and the Grand Marquis became the quiet, comfortable land yacht that carried a whole generation of grandparents to church and back. But that in-between space slowly vanished. Buyers either bought the cheaper Ford or stretched for the Lincoln, and Mercury was left selling slightly fancier versions of cars you could already get down the hall. In 2011, Ford finally let it go. The brand of the comfortable middle was gone. Now we come to Saturn, and this one is different. Because Saturn was supposed to be the future, General Motors launched it as a different kind of car company, a fresh start built from the ground up to fight the Japanese imports. It had a dedicated factory in Spring Hill, Tennessee, dent-resistant plastic body panels that would not rust. And best of all, no haggle pricing, one fair number on the windshield, no fighting with a salesman. People genuinely loved their Saturns. The company held owner picnics, and thousands of people actually showed up driving across the country to a car factory for a barbecue. But General Motors slowly starved the brand of new models and let it drift back into ordinary GM products. When the bankruptcy came, a deal to sell Saturn to another company collapsed at the last minute, and in 2010 the different kind of car company was shut down. The picnics, the loyalty, the whole experiment simply ended. Our sixth brand takes us back further to DeSoto. This was Chrysler's mid-priced brand, named after the Spanish explorer, and in the 1950s it was a sensation. DeSoto wore some of the wildest, most beautiful tail fins of that whole chrome-dipped decade, part of the design language Chrysler called the forward look. For a moment, a DeSoto in the driveway said you were a family on the rise. But the brand was squeezed between Plymouth below it and other Chrysler brands above. And when a recession hit at the end of the 50s, mid-priced cars were the first thing buyers abandoned. Chrysler pulled the plug in 1961 so abruptly that some dealers were left with brand new cars and a brand that no longer officially existed. The most beautiful fins of the 50s were finished. Now to one of the proudest names of all, Studebaker. Long before it built a single automobile, Studebaker built wagons, the actual covered wagons that carried families west, out of its home in South Bend, Indiana. When the automobile arrived, Studebaker made the leap, and for decades it was a respected independent, giving us the bullet-nosed cars of the early 50s and the sleek, futuristic Avanti. But an independent car company in a world of Detroit giants was always fighting uphill. It could not spread its costs the way the big companies could, and slowly it bled. By the mid-1960s, the famous South Bend factory had gone quiet. The final cars built across the border in Canada, and then nothing at all. A company that had moved America west for over 100 years was gone. Our eighth name is Packard, and to understand it, you have to understand that there was a time when Packard, not Cadillac, was the great American luxury car. Ask the man who owns one, the advertisements said, and they did not need to say more before the Second World War. A Packard was the carriage of presidents and movie stars, hand-built and magnificent. But the war and the years after it were brutal to independent luxury makers. To survive, Packard merged with Studebaker, and the marriage only dragged both down. The last true Packards rolled out in the mid-1950s, and by the end of that decade, the name that had once outshone Cadillac was simply gone, remembered now mostly by collectors who polish them at weekend shows. Ninth is Hudson, a Detroit brand with a glorious fighting spirit. In the early days of stock car racing, the Hudson Hornet was nearly unbeatable, its low-slung step-down design hugging the track while taller cars wallowed. For a few seasons, the Hornet ruled the dirt ovals of America. But like the other independents, Hudson could not survive alone against the giants. In 1954, it joined with Nash to form American Motors. And within a few short years, the Hudson name was quietly dropped from the new cars. The little brand that beat the giants on the racetrack could not beat them in the showroom. And that brings us to our 10th and final name, American Motors itself, the scrappy underdog that those mergers created. American Motors, AMC for short, spent decades as the plucky fourth company taking on the big three with smaller, stranger, more interesting cars. It gave us the Rambler, the funny little gremlin, the bug-eyed Pacer with its enormous glass, and the muscular Javelin and AMX. It even owned Jeep, which is the one piece of it that lives on today. But being the underdog meant never quite having enough money, and after years of struggle, AMC was bought by Chrysler in 1987 and folded in. The Gremlins and Pacers became punchlines, then memories, and the last truly independent American car company of its era disappeared into a bigger one. So what does it all add up to, this long list of vanished badges? It is easy to say these were just business decisions, mergers and balance sheets and brands that no longer made sense. And that is true, but it misses what was really lost. Each of these names was a kind of belonging. When a family bought Oldsmobiles for 3 generations or stayed loyal to Plymouth through every hard year, the car was not just transportation. It was an identity, a small flag you flew in the driveway, a way of saying who you were and where you stood. The disappearance of these brands is really the story of how American life got bigger and more efficient, and a little less personal. The crowded, colorful road of a dozen proud names narrowed into a handful of survivors. Something practical was gained. Something warm was quietly given up. The next time you pass an old building with a faded outline on the brick where a dealership sign used to hang, slow down for a second. Somebody bought their first car there. Somebody learned to drive in something with a badge that no longer exists. These names carried families across a whole century of American life, and then, one by one, they pulled off the highway for the last time. They are gone now, all of them. But they are not nothing. They were the cars we grew up in, and they deserve to be remembered.